Okay, so today's project is a very quick watercolor card. And the time this took from beginning to end, exclusive of drying time, was 20 minutes. So the trick here is to let your stamp do the work and use some heat embossing to make it even easier. So I'm starting out with some Artist Loft watercolor paper, that's the Michael store brand, and some Ranger embossing powder in Queen's Gold. And the stamp set is Sign and Says Stamp Beautiful Flowers. So, in any stamp image obviously would work. I do find it easier to work with an embossing powder that you can see easily. White and clear embossing powder is a little harder to see. So I'm going to start with an under layer, and I'm using Stampin' Up! Ink refills, dye ink refills, to do this. I've used one drop of each color and quite a bit of water, and the paper is wet, and the paint is very wet, and I am just slopping it on. So I've chosen some colors that kind of go together, a couple of yellows, a reddish color, and a hot pink. And literally, you can see that I am just slopping this paint onto the paper without really taking too much care. I'm just giving some color variation to the first layer. So I'm getting a lot of water on the paper to make sure that color kind of moves around and blends. And I don't have the patience to create that color variation when I'm actually painting the watercolors, but if you do an underlayer that's got a mixture of colors, you get that color variation in the final product without having to actually kind of paint it on as you go at the end. So this is a cheating way to get to a pretty good looking watercolor. The person who made the stamp image put in all the detail, and this underlayer is putting in the color variation. So I am going to use the matching die cut to cut these out. You could also fussy cut, but I'm just making sure that the edges are not going to be too stark white and the colors are going to move around. So when we get ready to do the next pass of color, the color needs to be a little deeper. So I'm adding a little bit more reinker to each of these colors, and I am going to bring in a green color for the leaves, which is garden green. And the first layer is dry. You can let that air dry, or you can speed it along with your heat tool, but it is a little bit tricky when you're working with heat embossed image, because you don't want to put too much heat on it and remelt that embossing powder. So you just have to use your judgment. Air drying didn't take too long, so I think that's probably the way to go, but you can speed it along if you want to. So now I'm just taking the slightly more intense versions of those same colors, which were Stampin' Up's Daffodil Delight, Mango Melody, Flirty Flamingo, and Melon Mambo. And I'm just painting over the flowers in this slightly deeper tone. Because the first layer of watercolor was a mixture of colors, and they were slightly different colors, it's bringing some color variation to the final flowers. But the illustrator has put in the details in these flowers, so I am again just slopping the paint right on there. I'm not taking a lot of time. I don't have much skill as a painter, but the finished product is really going to look quite nice, even though I'm not bringing a lot to the table here. So I think that this is a process that anybody can do. Really, it's putting the stamp to paper and putting a little color on top. So I am trying to get some difference between the three flowers so they stand out from one another, and then I'm bringing in that green color for the leaves. I think that there are really two different sets of leaves on this stamp. There's some skinnier leaves and some fatter leaves. So I did mix the green and yellow colors to get a slightly different shade for the leaves. I don't know that that's really required, but it did distinguish them from one another a little bit. I'm keeping my brush pretty wet, and I am using just one brush. I'm not switching back and forth or trying to pull the color out with clear water or anything like that. Just putting that watercolor straight over the heat embossed space and letting the heat embossed lines provide the detail for the image. Now I did fix 2 cards, and I think that's always a good idea if you've got all of your supplies out. You might as well do 2 as long as you've got everything out. But in this case, I am going to use these for Mother's Day cards, and I have a mother and a mother-in-law. So I have a reason to have two exactly the same. But just as a general principle, I do think it's worthwhile. You've gone to the effort, and I think it does make you a little bit more willing to give away your hard work if you've got 2 versions of the same card. So as long as you've got everything out, why not? And particularly in this case, I pulled out 1 sheet of watercolor paper, cut it in half for this extra large stamp. I may as well stamp on both halves of the watercolor paper. I have used a variety of different watercolor papers over time, and this particular image I stamped on the Artist Loft Michaels brand. It is not the heaviest watercolor paper. I think if you're following along with the Tim Holtz video and doing something with a lot of water, this may not stand up. But for watercoloring a stamped image, it was perfectly fine. And also, the thinner watercolor paper does dry a little bit faster. That thick watercolor paper, I think, can take an awfully long time to dry because it is so thick it'll absorb quite a lot of water. So you do have to give some thought to what you're choosing. And you do need watercolor paper in order to do watercolor painting. Straight up cardstock, the paint or dye reinker or whatever you're using is not going to move very smoothly. You can apply gesso to straight cardstock in order to use it as watercolor paper, but I think on the whole you're probably better off using watercolor paper or mixed media paper in order to do these watercolor techniques. So it's particularly when you go with store brands, it's not very expensive, and I think in this case having the right product for what you're doing is definitely worth the effort. So after I finished painting and let everything dry for just a second, I did use the matching die to die cut it, and you do want your watercolor painting to be completely dry before you die cut, because otherwise you will rip your hard work. And these are the finished cards. So I hope you've enjoyed this and that it inspires you to go to the effort to do a 20-minute watercolor card. And I'll see y'all next time. Thanks.